Hi, I'm Jeff Senny. Welcome to Making Waves on Purpose. Today, I'm joined by Daryl Brewster. Daryl is the CEO for CECP. CECP, if you don't know what it is, it's Paul Newman's old nonprofit. It was originally the Committee to Encourage Corporate Philanthropy, and in 2020 changed its name and its focus. It's now the Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose. Fantastic organization doing really interesting work. I think they've got over 200 companies that are in its network or affiliated. They also have the CEO Investor Forum that is part of their group and their effort. Does great work. And Daryl was a CEO of public companies and sat on public boards. So really brings a very deep knowledge of business and how to integrate this. You'll see in our conversation, I think he does a really great job of using the ideas and vocabulary and equations of business and integrating ESG or CR and DEI into that. So it doesn't feel so foreign. So it feels like it is a connected and integrated part of how the business operates and what it does. Great conversation. And super happy to have had him on the podcast. Enjoy. Daryl, good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Jeff, great to be here with you. Good to see you again. And thanks for all the great work you're doing in the field.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, tell us what CECP is doing these days. What are you all up to?
Yeah, these are crazy days, as you know, and we continue to look to support our network of more than 200 companies and really empower them on their purpose journeys, which we define as sustainable business success through a positive impact on the world. It's an interesting time to go through that. The crosswinds today on that journey, I don't think have ever been as intense as they are right now in so many different areas. They're really kind of swirling. And this is in kind of that post-COVID swings we've seen in supply and demand across multiple industries that were in favor a few years ago. Now it aren't. High interest rates, other things that we're seeing in the States, inflation. But three buckets are really the geopolitical, kind of regional issues around certainly the Middle East over the last few weeks, China, Ukraine, others that are out there. In the States, the political divide is very real. And there's an election coming up, less than a year from now. And it's only going to intensify. And then I think the blowback we're seeing from companies who had taken on key challenges or issues, some thought they were pretty low key. And the social media piece has been, I think, very, very big. So our challenge is to help companies navigate these crosswinds. All right. And we think it starts with purpose. It is, in our view, the North Star for companies as you go forward, as they look to address asymmetric stakeholder needs with appropriate plans and resilience within the organization. Jamie Dimon, in his last letter to his shareholders, just talked how purpose-driven companies continue to outperform over time. We believe in that. And that's why we just convened 50 CEOs at CECP's 18th Board of Boards to talk about purpose-driven leadership in volatile times. So I think these are areas that we're really focused as a group and organization to really help support companies on the journey, continue to help encourage them along.
I love that. I love the framing of these swirling winds too, because sometimes they're at your back and then unexpectedly they can turn quickly and be in your face.
And I think it's exactly what we're seeing right now. It's just coming from different directions. Sometimes it feels like some of the we do in the movement, it's behind you. It seemed like that during COVID very strongly, but these things can reverse. So that's really, I think, the challenge of the companies. And just as you're sailing a ship, if you don't have the GPS, you look for the North Star. I think that's where the corporate purpose, that why of the organization really comes to play.
I think that makes a lot of sense because for years, the management dogma was companies wanted predictability. It wasn't that they wanted to crush compliance. It wasn't that they didn't want any expectations on them. They didn't want everyday changing expectations because that's hard to manage to, and that's hard to build a company around. And that's in some ways exactly what they're getting. So it makes it all the more challenging. So I love the idea of like purpose being the kind of steadying, influence or guiding star, as you said.
Yeah, it gives you a general direction when you're having the issues, as we talk with our CEOs at our board of boards. Now I can't be purpose driven because things are changing too much. No, that's exactly why you need to be purpose driven, so you can really make sure you're focused in on your end result, your North Star, your goal, your vision as an enterprise.
Yeah. And how do you see companies navigating this ESG backlash? Like, what tips do you have for them?
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating. And I think it's helpful maybe to go back in time a little bit on this one. And I'll talk about the tips as well. It was 2004, from what my research has indicated, that this came out of the UN. And the idea around environmental, social, and governance metrics were factors that just didn't get captured in traditional look back financial statements, your balance sheet, your income statement, just those aren't there. And yet you knew those were potentially huge risks to companies and to society at a broader level. There was sort of a slow and steady growth. I can recall probably 7 or 8 years ago, and I was just learning. I'd been a former public company CEO, sat on public boards, this whole area about ESG, and was asked by New York Stock Exchange, when they had governance services, to do a talk on it. And I figured there's no better way to learn about a subject than to help to teach it. And went out to the West Coast in the US, 100 directors, corporate directors. That was 7 or 8 years ago. And my first slide went up, a little PowerPoint, ESG. And I said, how many of you all have talked about this in your last board meeting? And I have 101 hand went up. I said, how many have ever talked about it in a board meeting? 2 or 3 more went up. How many know what ESG is? 2 more hands up. We're less than like 10% of the organization. These are corporate directors. It's 7 or 8 years ago, but it's just 7 or 8 years ago. Had any idea? So snarky as I was, I said, all right, how many of you all could spell ESG? And after a few laughs, a gentleman in the back of the room said, what does this ESG stand for? And I said, well, these are material risk factors to the enterprise that don't get captured in look-back financials. No, what does it stand for? I said it again. What do the letters stand for? I said, well, the E is about environment. The S is about social. The G, as I started to get the word governance out, he said, social sounds like socialism. Man, the crowd had the whole piece. Now, obviously, it has had great progress since then, ESG. And I think during COVID really accelerated, where it became part of the lingo conversation within the group. As a result of that and that backdrop, I think a couple of things have happened. One is the ESG movement still had lots of angles to it. And there wasn't great clarity about what it really is. Is ESG a movement, or is it E, comma, S, comma, G, 3 different measures? Is it plural or is it singular kind of a piece? And so that complexity, and different people had different interpretations of that. And the second is, despite that, there was progress being made. And you only get pushback if things are sort of working. And I think that's what really was happening within the field and the space. And I actually think that is going to be beneficial, because it can really help us clarify what do we mean with ESG. We're getting metrics. We had SASB and GRI, and we've got ISB and others trying to get standard metrics on it. But what does that really kind of look at today? And I was struck. I was in a meeting with some European friends and allies in the field, and they were talking about new laws being passed there. And one of them commented, ESG now in Europe stands for every single gauge. 50,000 companies being asked, not just the version of the Fortune 500. And a couple of days later, I was at a board meeting. I was just pulling into the parking lot and listening to a radio show. It was AM radio show, talk show. And the guy started it out. He said, I'm going to devote today's conversation to ESG. And I was kind of blown away that would be the topic on a kind of a populist conservative talk show. And he started out his session by saying, you know what ESG stands for? Evil socialist government. I think those are the sides we have in this piece. And I think businesses are kind of caught in that crosswind, right? Of some asking companies to do even more and do more in the whole ESG space, and others saying, don't touch it. Remember, we've changed in the US under ERISA. We've had 5 different statements over the last 20 years about whether you could even use ESG to report on. It was banned by the Bush administration, took to the second administration, Obama, to say it was required, banned again under Trump. The Biden administration said it was optional. And the U.S. Democrats said, we don't even want that, although it was vetoed. So it's been kind of a complex field here for folks as we go through it. And then what we're seeing today among our companies is they're really focusing in on, we're seeing it separate in maybe 3 camps. One camp is very much, we're staying the course. That number, by the way, we just did a polling recently, had dropped by about 20 percentage points from the spring. But that was about a third. It was the largest of the groups. Roughly a third also said, look, we're going to continue to do this, but we're just going to call it something different. And we're not going to talk a lot about it.
Be a little more quiet.
Green hushing, I think they call it now. And then a third said they were rethinking this. Did this really make sense for the enterprise? So that's a substantial change that we've really kind of gone through during that time frame.
Yeah. But, when we were in the green room, you mentioned this, that there is some positive to come out of this. There could be some upside to this correction, air quotes.
Yeah, I think there will be, because I think you're going to get clarity around what it means in ESG. Because I think for some people it was, you got to do more of it. Every company needs to be measuring and talking about each of these specific issues. Others saying you should do none of it. But I think it's going to help us get to a better place. We've identified with our companies is really three things that we think are really valuable as you navigate the field here. And regardless of where you see this piece going on. One is, again, to lead with purpose. And I think it puts ESG into perspective. We've created a purpose pyramid. It starts with purpose. Talk about your stakeholders. We'll talk more about your integrated long-term plan, how you're going to do it. And then underneath that are the metrics, which could be financial metrics, reputational metrics, as well as environmental, social, and governance metrics. But put that in context, that it's not, ESG is sort of the result of the efforts that you're going to take, or the ESG metrics we have out there. Second is the research is pretty clear. Bain's out, McKinsey's out. Companies that really abide by material, that's a key word, relevant ESG factors, tend to outperform. Cost of capital is lower. They expand margins because they're really tackling issues that others aren't doing necessarily. Some of this is regulated, some of it's responsible, and some of it's competitive advantage. And the third, I think, is talking about this in human terms. I think we lost that a lot in the ESG movement. I've been part of it, et cetera. And I kid like Mindy Luber over at Ceres and talks about, 2 degrees Celsius and we're 1.8. And I'm like, with all due respect, in America, no one knows what Celsius is. Very few of us do, unless we happen to live in Europe or Argentina. And by the way, 1.8 or 2 degrees doesn't sound like a lot. I mean, the temperature just changed that much this morning. So it isn't relevant to people in a mass area. And I think that was exploited by some who were perhaps for other reasons had issues with it. I think the pieces is, I think we can get alignment around clean air, clean water, treating people well, or reasonably well in that, having good governance practices. This notion of responsible business, I think, makes a lot of sense. We're working and we'll be publishing a toolkit on this thing for companies. Just to how do you discuss this? And this whole area of responsibility is something I think people can be aligned of. And then the anti-responsibility group is just in favor of irresponsibility. So I think that's a much better place to be.
I think that's exactly right. I love what you say, you only get pushback if things are working. But I also think that some of this lands at the feet of the community that you and I are a part of, in terms of promoting corporate responsibility or ESG. And this idea of materiality, I think that's absolutely critical. I saw Richard Edelman talked about how he really wants it to be a single metric rather than this wide variety of metrics that we have. And I think that's, in practice, that's not very realistic, but I get the point. And I would say a single metric for each company that they pick their lane on. And I don't know that it's, right now it's D&I and it's climate change, and biodiversity and nature is coming in quick. So maybe it's 2 or 3. But not everything is relevant to or material to every company. It just isn't.
Yeah, now Richard sits on our board at CECP, so I won't disagree with him publicly. but we actually think there's a different approach on this, which is, at some level, it is the individual is going to make a decision either to work for that company or not, to buy products from that company or not, to invest in that company or not. So ultimately, people boil this down to sort of a single binary decision, and among others that they have. At the same time, we actually think it's valuable to look at this on a much more integrated basis. And we do that with our CEO Investor Forum, where we ask companies. We've created a framework with investor input, issuer company input, as well as that from intermediaries, experts like Richard, professional service firms, and the rest, to really look at an organization, kind of a mini strategic plan for the company that is integrated, number one. Number two, it's forward-looking, because that's really where the value is it's helpful, your background and how you've done establish credibility, but where are you going from here? And that's, as you think of an investor, it's nice to see what you did yesterday, or you're going to go to work. That gives you a foundation, but it doesn't tell you where you're going. And we've identified, kind of 11 key factors, 25 questions for companies to ask. And we just had our 11th CEO Investor Forum. We had $1 trillion of market cap share their integrated sustainable value creation plans with long-term plans with investors, all available online. People can look at what companies are doing, from Nestle, the great food company in Europe, to United States utilities and others, to really have a perspective to bring that all together, because ultimately you'll make that decision. But these are the inputs I think that people can really have value in looking at.
I love that. I think that's so important what you're doing there, Daryl, you and your team, because this has to be an integrated conversation about how this connects to profit. Because let's face it, the purpose of these companies is a private good and a public good. And that's what we're trying to figure out the balance on. The private good of, hey, this is delivering profit to the company that it's been in a public company, is distributed to its stakeholder or its shareholders. Hey, I love that. I'm in the market. I want that, but I also want to make sure that the way in which that money is generated is responsible. It's got some mission or purpose behind it.
Right. Absolutely. Because it's, underpinning it. And it's our sense that if you do the things that are good for your stakeholders, and the stakeholders have asymmetric needs, right? The employees would like to get paid more. Customers would like to pay less. There have to be trade-offs made inevitably across those. But the companies who get that algorithm right, who perform that well, that is inexorably linked to performing better over time. So we think part of these plans, it's key, is you're really linking these and your ESG metrics, which are part of the plan, those are your risk factors, to the value of the enterprise, the sustainable long-term value, as well as to the values of the company. So you can have different areas. But those are areas where you really kind of connect the dots on this. And when companies get in trouble is when they have something that's inconsistent with what they're doing elsewhere. And you can evolve and change that, but you need to kind of signal that clearly to your critical stakeholders.
I think that's right, because I think this idea that these issues are not material and therefore you're banned from considering them, they may or may not be material. You should have the conversation among yourself and your stakeholders to find out. And if they are, manage them. And if they aren't, say they aren't. And that's that.
And I think companies in some cases, kind of created their own issue because if anybody else thinks it's material, I'll respond. And many of the requests have come in from these asymmetric needs. They're all valuable. They're all important, but companies got to integrate that, make the decisions. Inevitably, there's going to be some trade-offs. Ultimately, the role is for each of your stakeholders should be somewhat better off as a result of the enterprise. And when a company only focuses on one, often it's the investors, sometimes it could be others, or is forced to do that. That's usually when you don't really create sustainable value, right? It's a short-term win, but not a long-term success.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's so important. You mentioned earlier geopolitics, and I'm, in some ways, ESG is just looking at the world through a broader lens, and geopolitics is part of that lens and has long been part of the lens that companies have had to look at their operations through. Changes you mentioned, Ukraine and China, and recently the Middle East. Tell me, what are you hearing and thinking from companies and tips and tricks you have there in managing what is clearly a VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's very real. Companies, particularly global companies, need to address these issues. There are certain things that can be anticipated and others that are surprises, and you have to be ready in this VUCA world for all of those. What we're really seeing is as incidents occur, just had now in the Middle East recently, and others that will occur. It's really kind of three areas that we kind of companies is this something you want to speak out on? Right? You don't have to speak out on every issue, and we saw that like with George Floyd. And I remember talking with one CEO, saying, I don't know if I should speak out on this. I said, before you make a decision, see the video. And once he saw it, I said, we've got to have a statement made, right? There are certain events that we have to realize and speak out. And that's one area. I think in Ukraine, we saw that the Middle East situation is far more complex. I was talking with a CEO whose building is in the U.S. community is on Palestine Way. She happens to be Jewish. She's going to support personally what's happening in Israel, but said putting out a statement was only going to create other issues that probably were not beneficial. So I think the companies have to be more careful in thinking through those as they go through what the implications are of those and which audiences you're talking about. I think the second piece is when there is an emergency situation like we've seen, we are seeing that companies are rallying through disaster relief and all. We're dealing with climate crises, but we're also dealing with human-made crises, as we've seen in Ukraine and others. And so I think companies stepping up on those are really key. I think the third dimension is when you need to adjust your business, right? And when something is just at a point where you've got to make it for managing your risk, your supply chain, other issues is key. And I think Ukraine, a couple of examples of that I think that are happening. One is Ukraine situation. And when Russia invaded, came in, over 1,000 companies within a 2 to 3 week period pulled out of Russia, pulled their business out, not just statements. They made action. And I think action is one we'll hear more of. Compare that to apartheid. It took 3 decades for 100 companies to pull out. So just the speed with which this is really happening and having an impact on that area. A second area, and related to that one, I remember talking with a CEO in the credit ratings, one of the major credit companies, and they wanted to put out a statement, and he had a statement ready to go, and his team said, do not put it out. He said, we're a credit rater. Let us go through the discipline of rating the credit for Russia. Let that speak for what our work is rather than some statement. Fascinating area. You can imagine they went through the analysis and they downgraded the Russian debt. And that's how companies can really make a difference, right? Sometimes by doing business in the way you've done it can really make an impact. And I think the other area I think we're seeing a big increase among many of our companies is or nearshoring from a manufacturing standpoint, particularly out of Asia, and just having alternate ways to look through that. We've talked before about people pulled out of Russia. What happens if China does something? And I think companies now need to think through that world about having some alternate supply areas. How do you really engage with that? The trade-off between the intellectual property rights relative to lower cost labor. Companies have to look through these, weigh the pros and cons of those and boards, I think in a more holistic way, in a more integrated way than they have traditionally, which was, hey, they can produce it cheaper, we'll just go there. Well, if they can produce it cheaper, but don't have the labor standards in place, and we're going to end up with a Bangladesh fire, that offset for the fashion industry, just huge, whatever the savings were, certainly offset by that. And that's where I think an ESG type of risk management mindset can be very, very helpful for companies.
I love that. I mean, because at the end of the day, and you said this earlier, look back financial statements, can we balance those out with a broader set of metrics, a broader set of thinking that can help to understand the risks and opportunities associated with these issues? For example, climate change, and how's it going to affect your business in 10, 20 years? How's it affecting it today?
Exactly. Well, and that's why we think the value of companies sharing an integrated long-term sustainable value creation plan is really helpful. If you look at the valuation of our companies, 95% plus of the value of the enterprise, the market cap, is based not looking backward. That's helpful. It's a base. Right. But it's based on the discounted, and of course they go down with interest rates going up, risk adjusted, that's where ESG comes up, future cash flows. I mean, that's where the value is. So as we think about that, or where you want to go to work, or who do you want to buy from, or who you want your community, those factors really matter. They aren't captured in look-back financials, but they're really critical to the valuation of the enterprise. And that's what we seek to do and provide tools for companies so you can develop an integrated sustainable plan, share that with your group. And one of the great feedback we've picked up, not only has it been helpful, I think, to investors, and there are short-term traders and there's long-term investors and there's hold forevers like Vanguard and BlackRock and in areas, the index funds. But one of the great values of that has been for the company, because now everybody in a relatively short piece, fairly concise, can get a good sense of how these things are all connected, especially for chief sustainability officers and others, which is, here's how it fits to the enterprise. Here's how it relates to our values. Here's how it relates to the value of the enterprise and the impact we can have on society.
I love that because, well, first of all, I love how you and CECP use the language of business to introduce these concepts. So the equation that you just used is a economist or a corporate equation. Yes. And then ESG fits within that equation rather than us introducing an entirely new school of thinking, which I think is really powerful. I also think none of this makes sense unless it serves as a management tool to do better business. And so creating like an integrated sustainability long-term plan is exactly that. And it may serve as a reporting tool, but it also serves as a management tool of how can I continually improve my business.
Exactly. And that's, I think, the value of the framework, which is, we can report on things. Does it get embedded and integrated within the group and the organization? We were asked by a group to do a session on how do we really share ESG principles with frontline workers. And frontline workers is something we've talked a lot about. And we spoke with our company and said, before we get the frontline, we need to get the C-suite and our senior executives on board to understand how this connects to the value of the enterprise, what people are doing, the values that we espouse as as a company. And it is more than just reporting. It should be a management tool to really look at weighing these pros and cons, as we talked about on geopolitical issues as well.
I love it. I love what you're doing. I'm thankful that you all are doing it. And any closing thoughts?
No, I think it's a fascinating time now. I think these crosswinds are going to create tremendous opportunity, for the area. And I think we come back to just the importance of purpose within the enterprise, the why of the company, how that connects to critical stakeholders, and this role of business to create sustainable business success. I mean, that's what it's designed to do. Reward the risk bearers, those who are part of the enterprise. But you do that through having a positive impact on the world. And that's where we think, really key. And I go back more to Adam Smith and Milton Friedman in terms of that work, but the role of the entrepreneur or the business is to solve the unmet needs of society. So that's, I think, an area that companies can really do. And within those crosswinds, there are now new opportunities emerging that we might not have seen long ago.
It's so funny you mentioned Milton Friedman. For so long, myself included, we've used that as the business of business is business, his famous saying, as a kind of banner of how he got it wrong. I actually agree. The business of business is business, and this is that. ESG is part of that.
I actually think, as a former a major in economics, he's quoted a lot because he said a lot of stuff. He published a lot of paper. Probably his top one was the role of business, within the rules of the game. And by the way, the rules have changed quite a bit since the early 70s, 50 years ago, is to increase profits. I think that's fair. He never talked about maximizing profits. A lot of people thought that was maximization first of all, you can't do it, but it's a one-time effort. Increasing profits, to me, is consistent with driving sustainable value. How do you do that over time after time? And as the society has changed, which it has, the rules of the game have changed, both regulatory, but also in terms of expectations. As Richard Ellman says, the most trusted organization today is not government. It's not media. It's business. Because business is seen as adaptable, it is seen as increasingly ethical and competent, but is to have an impact on that area. So I think those things are not totally inconsistent, and of how companies are looking at it. But it's how do you continue to build a great enterprise by really meeting the needs of your critical stakeholders?
I think that's right, and you use sustainable value, and part of the problem in the space is that we've conflated and kind of tied in knots the words around this. And I think you're using the term sustainable to mean like ongoing. Or continuing, yep, rather than environmental, which is how it's used so much within our space. So that's part of like ESG is really, you brought this up. It was created, Gavin Powell and Georg Kell, when I was at the Global Compact in 2004, they produced Who Cares Wins. And it was the birth of this concept in the ESG movement. And it was very focused on investors. Now everybody's got an ESG program, whether you're a private company, a public company, or because they've just used the term more broadly to cover.
It became a catch-all for all pieces. And once you make it a catch-all, then it had the risk of, and it was starting to work, had the risk of being politicized. And because it wasn't clear, and it has been, and because it wasn't crystal clear in terms of the communication, pretty easy to find some element of it that isn't right. I think if we get it to where it is, these are material risks of the enterprise. We need to get standard on that. It'll help put that into the context within how a company can really realize and advance its purpose.
I love it. We'll leave that as the last word.
Always.
Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Jeff. Cheers.
All right. Be well.